say it's a real honor to be here. It's a real honor to share the day with Oren and Rose. It's great to be at an organization that organizes mitzvah hours. Maybe you can do that more intensely up on Capitol Hill. It's a real mitzvah to be with Rose. I was thinking as you were speaking, as you said that this organization, which has been around for a long time, I want to get to that. One great way of raising money is a big audience for self-help and health books. I think if you did a book called Be Like Rose, you could keep the organization going for another 170 years. Also, it's great to see, actually, in a very brief moment, generational continuity with the award to Oren. So congratulations to you. I was actually, I've got to say, stunned. I did not realize that B'nai B'rith was 170 years old. That means you were around when John Tyler was president and there was a Whig party. So you have long survived the Whig party here. And I have to say, one of the things I get to do in my life most is talk and argue about politics with my friend David Brooks on NPR. And last year I published a book called Our Divided Political Heart, and I spent a lot of time looking at the Whigs. And I went in one day and I said, David, you know, this book was worth doing because I finally understand why you are utterly crosswise to contemporary American politics. You are the last living, surviving American Whig. And if you look at David's politics carefully, he didn't disagree at all. And we actually both share from our different perspectives an affection for the Whigs. I told that to somebody once, and they suggested we organize the most boring event ever in Washington. It would be modeled after Woodstock called Wigstock, but we were smart enough not to do that. I thank you for that kind introduction. It was better than one I once got. I was giving a talk on politics in the Midwest, and it ended. And now for the latest dope on politics in Washington. Here's E.J. Dionne. So thank you for that. The other thing I like to tell audiences is we columnists are often seen as a fairly arrogant lot. Indeed, many people think we work pretty hard at it. But these days, with those email addresses and those comments under your column, if that doesn't keep you humble, I don't know what does. And I actually once, this is one of the kinder ones I got, one that I can repeat to a polite audience. It began, Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person? And I love to use that at the beginning of talks because I can tell people that if you get nothing else out of this talk, you can at least answer that question for yourself. So, and I want to say it's great to be reunited with Dan Mariaschin. We met when he had, I believe, one of the toughest jobs in politics. He was, as many of you know, worked for Al Haig's campaign, the late Al Haig, General Secretary of State. And I guess you were communications director. Was that your title, Dan? And I want to tell you, there is no job worse in American politics than working for a candidate who's getting about 1 or 2% in the polls. Because the candidate, those candidates are actually usually very distinguished people, as Al Haig was, who have very distinguished careers, and they look around at these other guys running for president and say, you know, why am I at 1 or 2% of the polls compared to these guys? And if you're you know, Dan, on the one side, you've got the boss saying, why the hell am I, pardon me, not in the newspapers or on television? And on the other side, you've got all the reporters saying, why are you calling me about a candidate who's at 2% in the polls? And so Dan deserved combat and hazard pay. But he was incredibly gracious and loyal and helpful. And I really knew how much Dan was up against in that Al Haig campaign. And this is a true story. I was driving through New Hampshire on some road somewhere, and I saw a bumper sticker. This shows just, you know, presidential politics is mean and unfair. The bumper sticker had a mushroom-shaped cloud in the corner, and it said, Al Haig for president, let's get it over with. And so Dan survived and prospered after that campaign, and yeah, well, let's give Dan a round of applause. And deservedly so it's great to see you again, Dan. I think the theme of my talk might come from a quotation from Abraham Heschel, who's been a moral guide to me for many, many years. Although I'm probably misusing the quotation, I'll explain that, but Heschel said something that's always stuck with me. He said, "Wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge." And I love to contemplate that, and we could have a whole theological talk, but you're not here to hear me as an amateur theologian. And it's an odd slogan, actually, for journalists, because we're supposed to be the doubters, whereas I actually think we are all, in general, better off approaching the world in a spirit of wonder. I think there's another sense of that word, wonder, which very much applies to our politics. Things are so strange now that we are all in a state of wonder as to how did we get here, and how, as a country, can we get out of this polarized and very, very bitter mess. So what I want to do briefly is to give a little background on where I think we are at the moment, how we got here. Second, to talk about sort of three rather contemporary events very briefly: the shutdown, the recent elections, particularly in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City, the recent unpleasantness surrounding the Affordable Care Act, and then just talk a bit about where we might go from here. I'm not going to talk much about foreign policy, though I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to bring it up. So the first thing is, I think it's important, and here, I should say, by the way, just so there's truth in packaging, I am an unapologetic liberal or progressive, and my sort of core belief about America, I wrote a book last year called Our Divided Political Heart. And my core belief about who we are as Americans is that our country has always been torn by a deep but healthy tension between our love of individualism and individual liberty and our quest for and love for community. And I think lately we have told our story almost entirely on the individualistic side. And we've forgotten this part of ourselves that has built community both in the not-for-profit sphere through organizations like B'nai B'rith, but how we've also used government to strengthen the bonds of community. Let me just do this, because I love doing it these days with audiences. What is the first word of the Constitution of the United States? We. Exactly. Say it again. We. Because I love asking people to say it more than once, because we don't say we much anymore as a country. And I love that. I love the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, which actually lays out the purposes of government. I also like to point out it does call for providing for the general welfare, so welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. But in general, we are a we country. We're not just an I country. There's an important us in there. And the preamble also talks about ourselves and our posterity. And so at the heart of my worry about where we are now is we are forgetting this us, or we are two us's that kind of exclude the other, but we are actually one us, and therefore we could weather a lot of disagreements. Disagreement in politics is not a bad thing. As I often write to readers who disagree with me, I always say disagreement is one of the joys of freedom. But disagreement in a context of mutually assured destruction is not the path forward for our country. So that just gives you a general idea where I am coming from. I think we've seen a number of very specific changes in our politics. I really do think, with my friends Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, that we're seeing a period of asymmetric polarization. I think conservatism has moved farther to the right than progressivism has moved left. I could provide you with a lot of sort of empirical detail about that, but I think it's important to bear that in mind. I think it's important to bear in mind the changes inside a Republican Party that doesn't have people like Jack Javits or Mac Mathias or Ed Brooke or Clifford Case or Nelson Rockefeller in it anymore. And I think that's had an important effect on our politics. Now, it's entirely true that Democrats have shed their conservative, if you will, segregationist wing that was very strong back in 1960. But I think the polarization is asymmetric. I think the second big thing that happens, and it's related when you hear names like Rockefeller and Javits and Case and Brooke, is that there's been a major change in the Republican Party in terms of where its geographical base is and what dominates the party's thinking. I went back and looked, I compared, because the numbers were similar, the Congress elected in 1960 with the Congress elected in 2008. In the 1960 Congress, there were 174 Republicans. In the 2008 Congress, there were 178 Republicans. So more or less the same numbers. In that 1960 Congress, only 7 Republicans came from the states of the 11 states of the old Confederacy. 35 came from New York and New England alone, which is the heartland of that old modern republicanism. After 2008, 72 of the 178 Republicans were elected from those 11 southern states. There were only 3 from New York and none from New England in that Republican caucus. Now, those numbers changed a little bit as the Republicans gained a big packet of seats in 2010. But that balance, I think, is very important to bear in mind. It's something we can talk about, but I really think that that has had a material effect on national politics, and in particular on attitudes toward the national government. I think as a result of all this, the primary electorate within the GOP has changed to a greater degree than the primary electorate inside the Democratic Party. My friend Dan Balz, the great political writer for the Washington Post, did a fascinating piece after the 1996 election. I always say, if you don't like this polarization, blame Bill Clinton, but not in the way that you might think. Because after what in 92 and 96, you had a real secession, as it were, of moderate Republicans from the Republican primary electorate. If you look at places like Lake County, north of Chicago, or the suburban collar counties around Philadelphia, Montgomery County, Bucks County, those kinds of places, those have been a solid rock for the Republican Party for 100 years. They love people like George H.W. Bush or John Hines. Those places have now started to move either to purple status or in some cases to blue status. I think the best example of what happens with this change in the nature of the electorate was the race in 2010 between Representative Mike Castle in Delaware, very thoughtful moderate Republican, against Christine O'Donnell, who sadly for her is best remembered for saying the words, "I am not a witch." You remember that primary. Now, 10 years ago, Mike Castle would never lose an election, let alone a primary. Mike Castle would have won that seat by a landslide in 2010 if he had ever gotten the Republican nomination. But all the Mike Castle folks had left the party. The organization wasn't there. I actually went up to look at that race, and on the night before the election, there were about 7 or 8 people in the Mike Castle headquarters. He was loved across that state. He's still highly respected. And so I think that's another change. Now, you ask yourself the question, why is there so much ferment in the Republican Party right now? And I think it's very useful ferment. I'm going to get to that. And I think it's that sophisticated Republicans are taking a look at the last 20 years and figuring out we may have to do something different if we're going to win a national election. They can hold the House indefinitely on the basis of the lines that were drawn after the 2010 election. But the Republicans have only carried the popular vote in presidential elections once since 1992. Since 1992, no Democratic nominee, and these are figures from my friend Ron Brownstein in the National Journal, no Democratic nominee has gathered fewer than 251 electoral votes, and you only need 270 to win. Ron calls it the blue wall, where he counts 242 electoral votes that Democrats can very nearly count on going into a presidential election. It's very hard when you have to assemble all the others. It's almost exactly what the reverse of what we used to say in the Reagan years when people talked about the Republican Party's electoral college lock. Now, by the way, that Reagan example should make us a bit humble in making any prognostications, because Bill Clinton picked the Reagan electoral lock, and I think someone, and Chris Christie thinks he's the guy who could do it, could pick this could break through this Democratic blue wall. On the other side, you only count about 180 electoral votes that the Republicans can pretty well count on election after election. So that's another factor. A thing we have to look at that I think underlies our politics, again, especially at the national level, and you all know this, is demographic change. It's not just the increase in the share of the population that is non-white. And I want to say it, and an organization like B'nai B'rith would understand this well. I get a little unhappy when people sort of use numbers like, well, in X number of years, we will no longer be, the same nation because so many of us will be non-white. That's what they said about all us immigrants back in 1900. They said, that Italians and Jews and others who are coming in the country were going to change the United States in ways that would make it not like the United States anymore. Well, for goodness sake, we are Americans. We brought something. We are people who came in those years to the American experiment, but there's a real power to the American idea that affected every single one of us and our forebears when they came to these shores. But we did change the nature of the American electorate. We did, I think, make America a more open and tolerant place. And I think this new generation of immigrants are going to do that again. And then in particular, as long as there is such resistance to immigration reform on parts of, but only parts of, the conservative movement, I think this creates a challenge. And then lastly, there are young people. This new generation, partly because it is so diverse, is probably the closest thing we have to the old New Deal generation. That the old New Deal generation was the most liberal or progressive generation for a very long time. Subsequent generations have been more conservative. If you want to know why Republicans won a lot of elections, it was partly conversion of old New Dealers, but partly the passing of that great old New Deal generation. The new folks in the electorate, the people under 30 or under 35, are more on the progressive side of politics. And so for the long term, that I think suggests that the Republican Party is going to have to do a rethink. And I think two recent events have pointed to their need to do a rethink, but one recent event points to the Democrats' need to do a little rethinking. So I want to talk about that. The first is the shutdown. I don't have to go into great detail on the shutdown. You watched it. Most Americans do not like having the government shut down. It doesn't make sense that we can't resolve our differences except by threatening to default on our national debt or shutting down the government. Every time it's happened recently, the party, in this case the Republicans who were seen as responsible for it, got hurt. Although every time it happens, the entire political system, both political parties, get hurt. Congress's approval rating, you keep seeing these stories that Congress's approval rating is at its lowest point in history. I suspect at the current rate we'll be seeing a new in mathematics and polling, which will be negative numbers for Congress. Right now, the approval rating of Congress is down to 9%, according to Gallup. That's really astonishing. It's also dangerous, and I'm going to close on that. And I think, because of the way the shutdown, because the initiative for it came from the Republicans, they clearly suffered more than the president did and the Democrats did. And you saw that a little in the 2013 elections. I think there were two big stories out of these midterm elections. They're not even midterm elections, these off-year elections. And by the way, political reporters love to overread the elections that take place right after the presidential election, because we don't have enough elections to go on. We never have enough elections. I love elections so much, I once traveled to Corsica to cover a regional election, and I thanked the leader of the, in that case, the conservative wing of the assembly for bringing down the government. And he thought for 30 seconds that I was actually, or even a few seconds I was making a political point, and then he realized it was August on the Mediterranean. He looked outside at this bright sun and realized that every reporter in Europe was really happy to give more interest than I think they had ever given in their lifetimes to Corsican politics. So, but we don't have enough elections to go on in this period, so we do often overread, but sometimes we read it right. And in 2009, those who said that the election of Chris Christie in New Jersey and the absolute Republican landslide in Virginia told you something about what was going to happen in 2010. They were absolutely right. If you looked at what happened in 2009 in Virginia, the Obama constituency, if you will, withdrew or fell asleep. The turnout in those elections was far more Republican and conservative than the turnout in 2008. And lo and behold, both Christie and Governor McDonnell were kind of prefigured what was going to happen to the Democrats a year later and what was going to happen only a few months later when Scott Brown won in Massachusetts. This time, I think the signals went the other way. In Virginia, a very, very conservative Republican candidate, Ken Cuccinelli, I think was badly hurt by the shutdown, and his own people believe that, was badly hurt for being as ideological as he was. And the electorate that this contest produced was much more like the presidential year electorate than the off-year electorate of 2010. In New Jersey, Chris Christie won in part because he separated himself both from Washington, always, that's been a good idea in our politics for about 35 years, but also from the conservative wing of the Republican Party. I mean, Chris Christie's actually a very conservative guy, but he made nice to Barack Obama when he needed his help when his state got hit by a really bad hurricane, and that was enough to make him some kind of liberal to some people. But that actually was immensely helpful to him in this election, and he was very explicit in saying, I don't do business the way those guys in Washington do. In Alabama, one of the first times in a very conservative state, you saw the Tea Party candidate lose to a more conventionally conservative Republican, and in New York, you saw a big step in a progressive kind of populist direction with the election of Bill de Blasio. So I think that gives you a sense of a country that's, you know, I think moved a click or two to the left, but more generally a country that really wants to push away from Tea Party style republicanism. And I think that's starting to affect the Republican Party. Obviously, Democrats never have much use for the Tea Party. But I think that's an important development. So lo and behold, the Republicans take a 2x4 to themselves with the shutdown, and then, alas, the Democrats take a 2x4 to themselves with the failure of the website on the Affordable Care Act. I think this is very unfortunate, again, just to be out front. I think it's very important that the Affordable Care Act work. I think it is immoral that we leave 40 million Americans or so without health insurance. Yes, people can get health insurance in emergency rooms, but that is, number one, cruel, because all those folks cannot see a doctor earlier on when decent health care can prevent them from getting sicker. B, it's a wildly inefficient way to deliver medicine. Nonetheless, I think this was a terrible mistake. I do not understand fully, I don't think any of us does, how President Obama let this happen. He's obviously very upset with himself. I've never seen a president as penitent as President Obama was last week. I think it really showed his understanding that his drop in the polls on his approval rating in some ways matters less than his drop in the polls on trust. People always trusted President Obama even when they disagreed with him, and also on sort of personal favorability. A lot of people who may have disapproved of his policies at a given point basically still liked him. And I think he understood that this period and then the controversy over the assurances he gave people about their plans not changing really caused him some damage that went beyond what he had suffered before. And for Democrats, again, if I quote my friend Brownstein, or paraphrasing, Democrats had always looked at universal health care as a way in which you would invigorate liberalism. After all, Social Security and Medicare gave the country enormous confidence that government could do some good things for people, make the country fairer, and actually do it pretty well. Healthcare was supposed to do that. So to have this complicated system fail initially the way it did, I think is a substantial blow to progressives. And that's why it's so important that it work. I think you're seeing, and I'm sure many of you have read these stories, that a lot of Democrats in Congress are kind of pulling away from the president. 39 Democrats last week voted for this proposal by Congressman Upton, which was reportedly about fixing the problem of the cancellations on the individual insurance market, but really undercut the whole structure of Obamacare. The 39 was a kind of good news, bad news story for the president. The good news was they were worried about 80 to 100 before he made his public statement, so that number was smaller. It was about the same number that had voted with the Republicans on delaying the mandate on business. The bad news is 39 Democrats is a lot of Democrats. One of the reasons why the president won the shutdown fight is there was so much solidarity among Democrats and real division among Republicans. But I think in the end, for precisely the reasons that my friend Ron Brownstein and other writer Greg Sargent pointed out, I think Democrats have no choice but to make the Affordable Care Act work. And if they undercut it further, I think they will only hurt themselves, and they will only, in the long run, hurt a cause that I sure hope they believe in, which is eventually providing health insurance to all Americans. And I just make the point that in some states, the system is actually working well. I think a place to look is Kentucky, where Governor Steve Beshear decided this was going to be his great achievement as governor. He said, we're one of the unhealthiest states in the union by all the measures. We've got 20% uninsured. We can actually use this system to get everybody in Kentucky health insurance. And I admire what he's doing down there. And so I think this has to be made to work. I'm not optimistic in the short run. I think when you have a website problem of this kind, a lot of people who know more about that than I do say that it's going to be quite hard to fix. You've got some signals of that in papers this morning where they say, well, we're expecting 80% of people to be able to get through by the end of the month. On the other hand, I also have a lot of Jeff Zients, the guy they put in charge of it. I've known Jeff long before he got into politics. He's a very tough, smart business guy, and I think at least having somebody now at the top saying this has to work, looking systematically at how to fix it is helpful. And God, I hope there might be bipartisanship on one thing, which is our government does a lousy job of acquiring IT. This has been out there for a long time. The rules that on contracting that apply to IT that may be functional elsewhere are utterly dysfunctional when it comes to acquiring information technology. So I'd like to see us reform that. So I want to close with two last points. The first is, political journalism is so often, and in some ways, unfortunately, a game of metaphors. Everybody wants to look and say, this time is exactly like X. And occasionally the metaphor is really helpful and revealing, and occasionally the metaphor leads you exactly down the wrong path. And so I suspect that you're going to see dueling metaphors over the next period. These dueling metaphors have to do with the fact that, yes, President Obama is at a place in his popularity that he's never fully hit. He hit it a little bit in the summer of 2011. And so the most popular metaphor, obviously, among Republicans is President George W. Bush never recovered from Katrina and the reaction against the war in Iraq. And so right now, this is Katrina and Iraq for President Obama. You can't, if you understand, and Dan will certainly understand this as a former communications director, if I were a Republican communications director, I'd probably be saying the word Katrina over and over again in every soundbite. But there are two other possible metaphors, and I think that's going to be the interesting question. It was said that President Reagan would never recover from Iran-Contra, but he did. 4 to 5% growth in the 1988 election year helped a lot. And it was said that President Clinton would never recover from impeachment. And again, he did. In fact, if you look at both the Reagan and the Clinton popularity ratings right now, retrospectively, they are still awfully high. You know, there is so much, there's a lot of even Reagan nostalgia on the left. I say that as a progressive. I've even noticed lately things have moved so far that I've even started noticing Gingrich nostalgia among some Democrats. Who knew that we'd ever see that? I think the real challenge, you know, for the president is, in this particular case, to be more like Reagan or Clinton and less like Bush. I think he has it in him. I think there are ways to fix the website. I think a lot depends on whether we can speed up this economic recovery, whether we can stop doing what I see as dysfunctional things here that get in the way of the recovery. But that is where the game is. But just steel yourself for metaphor overload over the next month. The last thing I want to say is broader than that. You all know that there's a whole lot of talk about American decline. Now, I got to say right at the outset, I am very anti-declinist, and I'll explain why I am anti-declinist about us. But, you know, the first thing to realize about decline is, you know, talk about decline is as American as, oh, the B'nai B'rith. We always talk about decline. And that's a sign, first, of what a high sort of view we have of ourselves. We always think we're someplace from which we can decline. You know, secondly, we've been at this moment before. We have gone through crises of this sort before. The early 80s were a time of extraordinary speculation about whether we had it as a country. In that case, whether the Japanese were going to pass us by, whether the Cold War was going the wrong way. And declinism was wrong then. I also think that in the whole argument about, you know, we Americans are in decline, there is this view of American power in the past as if we, the whole world, used to do everything the United States wanted to do. I don't recall the world being like that in my lifetime. Some of you are old enough to remember when President de Gaulle and President Kennedy used to have fights about the future. You know, the French often did not do exactly what we wanted. We lost a war in Vietnam. We have had problems with allies, problems with adversaries. We're in a fierce competition with the Soviet Union. The United States was always a superpower, arguably the most important superpower, but we didn't have the world doing everything that we asked the world to do, let alone told the world to do. So I think, and this is a point that's made by Bob Kagan. Bob and I don't agree on everything, but I very much agree, the foreign policy analyst, but I very much agree with Bob that first we should stop pretending that we had sort of unencumbered power at some time in history and have lost it. But secondly, I don't see our necessarily on decline now. Joseph Joffe has a new book out, the German political analyst, very pro-American, and it's about the myth of American decline. It talks about what's happening in our energy industry and how we're coming closer to energy independence. It talks about our economic recovery. We are sluggish. We have problems with inequality in our country. But our economy, it's still underlying us, is very, very strong, comparatively speaking. So I don't think, and yes, we have new competitors in the world. India is rising, Brazil is rising. China is going through a complicated time right now, but it obviously is far stronger than it used to be. But we've dealt with competing powers before, so I don't think decline is the right way to look at the current situation. There is one thing, I think, that can guarantee American decline. And the one thing that can guarantee American decline is if we stay at doing politics the way we've been doing it over the last 10 or 20 years. The problems we face, whether they are budget problems, the problems with an aging population, the temporary blip caused by all of us baby boomers, those problems can be dealt with. These are not insurmountable problems. I believe there are things we can do about the decline in upward mobility, the decline in upward mobility and the rise of inequality. These are not insoluble problems. But if we stay at doing politics the way we are doing it now, then we will be the authors of our own decline. And that is not what we want as Americans. I was trying to, I changed the closing passages of my talk this morning after I read a wonderful piece in the Washington Post this morning in the Outlook section by Drew Gilpin-Faust, the president of Harvard University. I don't know if any of you've been too busy to read the papers this morning. But as many of you know, she is a great historian of the Civil War. And you know, amidst all the anniversaries we are celebrating, including the very tragic one on November 22nd, this week of John F. Kennedy's assassination, I had completely forgotten that we are also celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And Drew Faust's piece is about that, and at the end she says something that I hope every member of Congress reads this piece. She says, "We are far from modeling to the world why our or any democracy should be viewed as the best hope for humankind." She is following Abraham Lincoln's talk at Gettysburg. That talk at Gettysburg was about the extraordinary sacrifice being worth making because it could bring about a new birth of freedom in our country and in the world. And as Drew Faust said, I think we should heed Lincoln's exhortation and rededicate ourselves to honor those who died fighting for freedom at Gettysburg and in all the years since, by ensuring that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. I believe that we can still do that, and I know that we must. Thank you very much.